Richard Hamilton believed his world was built on a foundation of unshakable stone. As a senior vice president at Vance Global, a titan of industry with a staggering $22 billion market cap, his sense of self was inextricably linked to the company's granite and glass headquarters. He believed in hierarchy, in the natural order of things where men like him stood at the top, looking down. What he did not know, what he could not possibly comprehend, as he swirled the Cabernet in his glass at the city's most exclusive brunch spot, was that his world was actually built on a shifting dune of sand. And the quiet, unassuming woman who owned every grain of that sand, the very architect of his reality, had a son who was sitting right across from him, quietly enduring his sneering contempt. Within 2 hours, Richard Hamilton's stone foundation would be revealed as nothing but dust, and a lifetime of arrogance would come crashing down upon him. This story is about the moment that happens. It's about the quiet satisfaction of seeing arrogance meet reality. We've all been in situations where we felt underestimated or unseen, haven't we? If you have, I hope this story brings you a little bit of that vicarious vindication we all crave. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever wished you could have a moment like the one you're about to read. And if you enjoy what happens next, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories that remind us that true worth is never loud. Now let's go back to that brunch. The restaurant was a cathedral of modern wealth. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off polished silverware and the diamonds adorning the wrists of the city's elite. The air, thick with the scent of truffle oil and expensive perfume, vibrated with the low hum of self-importance. At the center of a prime table, holding court as was his birthright, sat Richard Hamilton. His face, florid and confident, was a mask of indulgent authority. To his right sat his wife Margaret, a woman whose features had been sharpened by years of social climbing, and whose smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. Opposite them, their son Bradley, a younger, softer, and more petulant copy of his father, was slouched in his chair, a smirk permanently affixed to his lips. Between them sat Sophia, Richard and Margaret's daughter, and the unfortunate bridge between two worlds. Her posture was tense, her fork tracing nervous patterns on her pristine white plate. She was beautiful, but today her beauty was eclipsed by a visible, painful anxiety. And next to her, the cause of both the family's scorn and Sophia's discomfort, was her husband, Ethan. To the Hamiltons, Ethan was an anomaly, a miscalculation in their perfectly curated lineage. He was an architect, a profession they equated with being a glorified tradesman. He was quiet where they were loud, thoughtful where they were impulsive, and humble where they were brazenly arrogant. He dressed in well-made but understated clothes, a simple navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, no ostentatious watch, no designer logos. In their world, this lack of adornment was not a sign of quiet confidence, but a declaration of mediocrity. He was a blank space in their vibrant, self-aggrandizing portrait, and they felt an almost compulsive need to color him in with their own shades of derision. "I must say, Ethan," Richard began, his voice booming with false geniality, a predator circling its prey, "it's awfully good of you to take time away from your blueprints to join us. I know how demanding it can be, drawing those little lines all day." Bradley snorted into his mimosa. "Yeah, Dad, but at least he gets to use different colored pens. That's got to be exciting." Margaret chimed in, her voice a silky, venomous whisper. "Oh, be nice, boys. I'm sure Ethan's work is very creative. It's so important to have a hobby that pays a few of the bills." Each word was a carefully placed stone, intended to build a wall of humiliation around him. They saw him as small, insignificant, a charity case their daughter had regrettably brought home. Ethan met the volley of insults with an unnerving calm. He took a slow sip of his water, his eyes clear and steady, meeting each of theirs in turn. He did not flinch. He did not scowl. He simply absorbed the impact, his expression unreadable. This infuriated them more than any angry retort could have. His dignity was a language they didn't speak, and an affront to their power. Sophia shifted beside him, a silent, miserable tremor. "Dad, please," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What? I'm just making conversation," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm interested in my son-in-law's career. It's my duty to be." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "Tell me, Ethan, what's the biggest project you've ever worked on? A two-car garage, perhaps? A particularly ambitious garden shed?" The laughter from Bradley was loud and jarring. Other tables glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the display of familial cruelty. Ethan felt Sophia's hand briefly touch his thigh under the table, a fleeting, desperate gesture of solidarity that lacked the courage of a spoken word. He gave no outward sign that he'd felt it. Instead, he placed his own hands on the table, palms down. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to his left hand, which rested near a simple, worn leather portfolio he had placed beside his chair. The portfolio was old, its corners softened with age, its surface bearing the faint scars of countless journeys. To the Hamiltons, it was just another pathetic accessory, probably holding a few crumpled drawings of a suburban kitchen remodel. They had no idea it was a symbol, a tangible link to a power so vast it could swallow their entire existence without leaving a ripple. Inside that portfolio, tucked between schematics and structural analyses, was a single, signed directive that could rewrite their futures in an instant. Ethan's calm was not passivity, it was patience. It was strategy. The game had already been set in motion, and the Hamiltons, in their blindness, were gleefully playing their assigned roles as pawns. Ethan was simply waiting for the right moment to say, "Checkmate." The assault on Ethan's profession continued, a relentless tide of condescension. Richard, having exhausted his weak jokes about sheds, leaned back and adopted the air of a benevolent king bestowing wisdom upon a peasant. "You know, Ethan," he said, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, "I've been thinking, you're family now, of a sort, and family helps family. The thing is, architecture, it's a noble profession, I suppose, for those who enjoy that sort of thing, but it's not stable. It's a young man's game, and let's be honest, you're not getting any younger." Ethan, who was a full decade younger than Bradley, simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible motion. "I appreciate your concern, Richard." The calm, measured response was like a splash of water on a grease fire. It only made Richard's arrogance flare higher. "Concern? It's more than concern. It's an opportunity." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were letting Ethan in on a world-changing secret. "Vance Global is always looking for reliable people. Not for anything important, mind you, but we have a facilities management department. They oversee the maintenance, the cleaning crews, that sort of thing. They're always needing people who can read a floor plan, tell the janitors where the new soap dispensers go." Bradley choked on a laugh, covering his mouth theatrically. "Dad, you can't be serious. You want Ethan to manage the janitors?" "I'm not saying he'd be a manager," Richard corrected, holding up a hand. "It's an entry-level liaison position. He'd be a go-between. It doesn't pay much, of course, but it's a steady paycheck, benefits, a real future, a foot in the door of a real company. Think of it, Ethan. You'd have a Vance Global ID card. You could finally say you're part of something significant." The offer hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the ultimate expression of Richard's worldview, that significance was something that could only be bestowed by an institution like his, and that the greatest gift he could offer was a chance to be the smallest cog in that massive machine. He was not just insulting Ethan's career, he was insulting his intelligence, his ambition, and his very identity. Sophia's face was a mask of pale horror. "Dad, stop it. That's incredibly offensive." Offensive? It's generous, Margaret interjected, her voice sharp. Your father is offering him a lifeline, Sophia. You should be grateful. We can't have your husband telling people he designs patios for a living. It's embarrassing. Ethan felt the familiar cold knot of anger tighten in his stomach. But on the surface, he remained a placid lake. He let the insult wash over him, letting them believe they had scored a decisive blow. His eyes drifted again to the leather portfolio by his chair. His thoughts, a stark contrast to his placid exterior, were precise and analytical. Inside that portfolio were the complete architectural plans for Vance Global's new 80-story European headquarters in London, a project valued at over $1 billion. A project that he, Ethan, had personally designed from the ground up. He had spent the last 6 months flying back and forth, overseeing soil tests, meeting with engineering firms, and refining a design so innovative it was set to redefine the London skyline. The very building Richard dreamed of one day visiting was the product of the mind he was currently offering a job, managing cleaning supplies. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost comical. He didn't need a Vance Global ID card. The company's future was, in a very real sense, being built from his imagination. He looked at Richard, a man so blinded by the logo on his business card that he couldn't see the architect of the empire sitting before him. "Thank you for the offer, Richard," Ethan said, his voice even and devoid of sarcasm. "It's very generous, but I'm quite happy with the projects I'm currently working on." His refusal, polite as it was a rejection of their entire value system. To them, it was incomprehensible. Why would anyone turn down even the lowest rung on the golden ladder of Vance Global? Richard's face darkened, his magnanimous posture crumbling to reveal the petty tyrant beneath. "Happy?" he scoffed. "Happy doesn't pay for a house in this city. Happy doesn't get your children into the right schools. You have no ambition, that's your problem. Sophia, I don't know what you see in him. Honestly." Sophia shrank under her father's gaze, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at Ethan, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. A plea for him to fight back, to yell, to do something. But she also knew that if he did, it would only make things worse. Her silence was her prison, a cage built from a lifetime of seeking her parents' approval. And in that moment, Ethan felt a pang of pity for her that was sharper than any of Richard's insults. He was not the one who was trapped. She was. He had the key to his own cage, right there in the portfolio beside him. He just wasn't ready to use it yet. The performance was not yet complete. Having failed to break him with attacks on his career, the Hamiltons, like cornered animals, instinctively went for a more personal, more venomous line of attack. The conversation shifted, guided by Margaret's expert hand, from Ethan's perceived professional failures to his background, a topic they considered ripe for ridicule. "Well, if he's so happy with his little projects," Margaret said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, "it's probably for the best. People should stay in their own lane after all. Ambition can be so unbecoming in those not born to it." She turned her gaze to Ethan, a predatory glint in her eye. "Speaking of which, Ethan, we so rarely get to talk about your family. How is your mother, Eleanor, isn't it?" The way she said the name Eleanor was a masterpiece of condescension. She stretched the syllables, infusing them with a delicate pity, as if the name itself were a burden. Ethan's posture, if possible, became even stiller. His mother was the one topic where his control was tested. He had steeled himself for this. He knew it was coming. "She's very well, thank you, Margaret." "Is she still living in that quaint little town in Vermont?" Margaret pressed, a surgeon probing for a weakness. "And she's still a teacher? Or has she retired from that now?" "She retired a few years ago," Ethan answered, his voice a flat, emotionless line. "Oh, how wonderful for her," Margaret sighed, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "I can just picture it. A little cottage, a garden, perhaps a book club with the other town ladies. It all sounds so simple, so refreshingly uncomplicated. Bradley, ever the dutiful echo, chimed in. Must be nice to have no stress. My mom's biggest stress is which charity gala to chair. Your mom's is probably what kind of jam to make for the church bake sale. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. Richard nodded sagely. There's a dignity in simplicity. Of course, it's a different kind of dignity from, say, shaping global commerce, but it's dignity nonetheless. They were painting a picture, for themselves and for the listening tables around them, of Ethan's origins. He was not just a man with a lesser career, he was a man from a lesser world. A world of bake sales and book clubs, of small lives and smaller ambitions. His mother, in their narrative, was the archetypal simpleton, a gentle, harmless creature to be pitied and patronized. The contrast with their own lives, of galas, boardrooms, and international travel, was the entire point of the exercise. It reinforced their own superiority. Ethan let the image settle in the air between them. He let them build the caricature of his mother, brick by ignorant brick. He thought of the real Eleanor Vance. He thought of her sitting not in a quaint cottage, but in the command center of her Global Foundation's headquarters, a minimalist, high-tech space that he himself had designed. He thought of her not discussing jam, but negotiating with heads of state over green energy initiatives. He thought of her not as simple, but as a woman whose mind was so complex and far-reaching that she had built a $22 billion company from a single, brilliant idea and then had the wisdom to step away from the daily operations to focus on changing the world in a more direct, philanthropic way. The woman they were mocking as a simple schoolteacher had, in fact, been a university professor of economics, whose groundbreaking thesis on sustainable corporate structures became the foundational blueprint for Vance Global. She had retired from teaching only to build an empire. The supreme irony was that their entire lavish lifestyle, the very brunch they were enjoying, the salaries that paid for Richard's expensive watch and Margaret's designer dress, were all funded by the profits generated by the simple woman they held in such contempt. This was the grievance Ethan cataloged most carefully. They could insult him, his career, his clothes. That was expected. But the casual, dismissive way they spoke of his mother, a woman whose shoes they were not worthy of cleaning, let alone judging, was an offense of a different magnitude. It crossed a line from casual cruelty to profound sacrilege. His calm was no longer just strategic. It was now a dam holding back a flood of righteous anger. He did not need to defend his mother's honor with words. The truth, when it came, would be a defense more absolute and devastating than any argument he could mount. He looked at Sophia. Her head was bowed, her blonde hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She was ashamed of her family, but she was also ashamed of his, or at least the version of his family that her parents had so cruelly invented. In her silence, she was complicit in their fiction. Yes, Ethan said finally, his voice so quiet it forced them all to lean in slightly to hear him. She enjoys her retirement. She finds it very fulfilling. His use of the word fulfilling was deliberate. It was a small, polished stone thrown back at them. He was using their own language of pop psychology and empty platitudes. It went right over their heads. They just heard the confirmation they wanted, that Eleanor Vance was a sweet, simple old lady, and that Ethan was, and always would be, from a world far beneath their own. The trap was now perfectly set. A lull descended upon the table, the kind of heavy silence that follows a particularly nasty exchange. The Hamiltons seemed to be momentarily out of ammunition, content to let their insults hang in the air like toxic smoke. Richard preened, believing he had established his dominance. Margaret reapplied her lipstick, a gesture of triumphant finality. Bradley scrolled idly through his phone, bored now that the main event seemed to be over. It was in this quiet moment, this pause in the storm, that Ethan truly began to observe. He looked at Richard, really looked at him. He saw past the bluster in the expensive suit. He saw a man terrified of irrelevance, a man whose entire identity was a corporate logo. Richard wasn't a titan. He was a functionary, a high-level one to be sure, but a functionary nonetheless. His power was borrowed, not owned. He was a steward in a kingdom, mistakenly believing he was the king. The arrogance was a shield, hiding a deep, gnawing insecurity that one day the real power might notice him and find him wanting. He turned his gaze to Margaret. Her face, a carefully maintained work of art, was a testament to her dedication to appearances. But her eyes, when she wasn't actively sneering, held a flicker of deep-seated anxiety. She was the keeper of the family's social standing, a full-time job that required constant vigilance. Every invitation, every charity board, every perceived slight was a battle in a war for status. Her cruelty was not born of strength, but of a desperate fear of social oblivion. One wrong move, one association with the wrong kind of people, like, in her mind, Ethan's family, could send their carefully constructed social pyramid tumbling down. And then there was Bradley. In him, Ethan saw the sad, pathetic end result of inherited status without earned merit. Bradley was a ghost in the machine of Vance Global, occupying a role created for him by his father, producing nothing of value, his presence justified only by his last name. His smirk was a defense mechanism, a way to project a confidence he had never had to build for himself. He was a hollow man, and the slightest breeze of real-world pressure would cause him to collapse. They were not giants. They were fragile, terrified people, encased in a shell of wealth and privilege, and their shell was about to be cracked wide open. As if on cue, the conversation drifted, as it so often did in Richard's presence, back to the source of all his pride, Vance Global. "The quarterly reports are going to be exceptional," Richard announced to the table, though his voice was loud enough to inform the surrounding diners as well. "We're projecting record growth, thanks in no small part to the European expansion." He was talking about Ethan's project. The irony was a physical presence, a ghost at their table that only Ethan could see. "There's still so much chatter about old E. Vance, though," Bradley said, looking up from his phone. "Nobody's seen her in years. Some people on the forums are saying she doesn't even exist anymore, that it's just a trust, a name on a letterhead." Margaret leaned in, her eyes alight with the thrill of gossip. "I heard she's a complete recluse, lives in a sealed compound somewhere in Wyoming, terrified of germs, utterly eccentric. They say she communicates only through encrypted messages and has a team of lawyers who handle everything." "Nonsense," Richard scoffed, though he clearly relished the speculation. "The lawyers are real enough, a veritable army of them. But she's real. She signs off on every major strategic decision. My sources say she's sharper than ever, just private, extremely private. She hasn't made a public appearance in 15 years. The mystery is part of her power, I suppose." They spoke of her as a mythical creature, a legend. They painted a picture of a bizarre, out-of-touch billionaire, a character from a movie. Their descriptions were a blend of awe, envy, and a complete lack of understanding. They were so close to the truth, yet so profoundly, cosmically far away. They were discussing the personal habits of the woman they had just dismissed as a jam-making schoolteacher from Vermont. Ethan felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a play for which he had written the final, shocking act. The actors were performing beautifully, hitting all their cues, completely unaware of the script's final pages. Sophia, who had been silent for so long, finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. "Maybe she just wants to be left alone. Maybe she doesn't care about the galas and the publicity." It was a small act of defiance, an attempt to defend a stranger who she felt was being unfairly characterized. It was also, unknowingly, a defense of her own mother-in-law. Richard waved her comment away. Nonsense. Everyone wants recognition. She's probably just some strange old woman who got lucky with one good idea a long time ago and has been hiding ever since. What does she know about the real world anymore? This was it. The final, perfect piece of hubris. The dismissal of the founder's competence. The assumption that his own boardroom-level view was the only real world that mattered. The quiet before the storm was over. The air was now charged, electric. Ethan picked up his water glass, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He took a sip, the cool liquid a stark contrast to the heat building inside him. He set the glass down with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. All eyes turned to him. The stage was his. The final insult hung in the air, a testament to Richard's profound ignorance. "What does she know about the real world anymore?" he had asked, a rhetorical flourish of arrogance. It was the perfect opening, the final misstep in a long dance of condescension. Bradley, sensing the tension but misreading its source entirely, decided to twist the knife one last time. He smirked at his sister. "Honestly, Sophia, I don't know why you put up with it. You could have had anyone. Instead, you marry a guy whose biggest ambition is to build a deck. You're going to end up just like his mother, living in some shack in the woods, pretending to be happy. Is that the life you want?" He then looked at Ethan, his eyes full of pitying contempt. "No offense, man, but you're dragging her down." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't a lull, it was a vacuum. Sophia's face crumpled, the cruelty of her brother's words hitting their mark. But before she could speak, before Richard could chuckle in agreement, Ethan moved. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't stand up. He simply adjusted his position in his chair, a subtle shift that drew all focus to him. He looked not at Bradley, but at Richard. "You mentioned the European expansion, Richard," Ethan said, his voice calm and conversational. It was so unexpected, so disconnected from the personal attack that had just occurred, that it took them all by surprise. Richard, caught off guard, blinked. "Yes, as I said, it's going to be a huge boon for the company. The primary contractor is Heston Construction, correct?" Ethan continued. "Yes, of course," Richard said, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "I negotiated the deal myself." He was proud of this, a major feather in his cap. "You should have gone with Bauer Group," Ethan stated, not as an opinion but as a fact. "Heston's supply chain for reinforced steel is unreliable. They've had 3 project delays in the last 18 months due to materials shortages. Bauer, on the other hand, has a direct and exclusive partnership with the ArcelorMittal foundry in Ghent. You would have saved 7% on materials cost and guaranteed the construction timeline." The table went completely still. This was not the language of a man who designed patios. This was the language of a man who understood global logistics, who knew the inner workings of billion-dollar construction deals. Richard's confident expression faltered, a crack appearing in the facade. How would you know that?" he stammered. Ethan ignored the question. He turned his gaze to Margaret. "You were speculating about Evance's penchant for privacy." Margaret, flustered, could only nod. "You're right that she values her privacy," Ethan said. "But it's not out of eccentricity or fear. It's for efficiency. She believes public attention is a distraction from the work. She doesn't communicate through encrypted messages. She prefers phone calls. And she doesn't live in Wyoming. She finds the winters too harsh." A wave of confusion washed over the faces of the Hamiltons. They were adrift, their comfortable narratives suddenly ripped away. They stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. The quiet, pathetic architect was gone. In his place was a man who spoke with an unnerving authority. Sophia was staring at him, her mouth slightly agape, her earlier tears forgotten. She was witnessing a version of her husband she had never seen before. Finally, Ethan's eyes settled on Bradley. "You said I was dragging Sophia down," he said, his voice losing none of its calm. "And you compared her potential future to my mother's life. You described it as living in a shack, pretending to be happy." Bradley, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. Look, man, I was just— You should know, Ethan interrupted, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense, that you are more right than you know. Sophia's future will be very much like my mother's, because my mother's life isn't one of quiet desperation. It's one of quiet command. He paused, letting the words sink in. He had them now. They were leaning forward, hanging on his every word, desperate to understand the new reality that was dawning before them. You've been speculating about the mysterious E. Vance, Ethan said, his gaze sweeping across their stunned faces. You wonder who she is, what she's like. He let the silence stretch, a perfect dramatic beat. Then he delivered the quiet bomb. You don't have to wonder. You've spent the last hour insulting her. The statement landed, simple, devastating, final. It did not compute. The Hamiltons' minds, so rigid in their social calculations, could not process the information. It was a logical impossibility. What are you talking about? Richard whispered, his face draining of all its florid color. E. Vance, Ethan said, enunciating each syllable with perfect clarity. Her first name is Eleanor. He let them make the connection themselves. He watched as the gears turned behind their eyes. Eleanor, the quaint school teacher, the jam maker, the woman in the cottage. He saw the exact moment the realization struck Richard. The senior vice president would know the full name of the company's founder. It would be on the original charter, a document he had probably seen 100 times. Eleanor Vance. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just been told the sky was green his entire life, and he was only now seeing its true color. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The diamonds on her wrist seemed to lose their luster. The insults she had so casually thrown, the pitying tone, the caricature of the simple life, it all came rushing back to her, each word now a burning coal of humiliation. Bradley just looked blank, confused. Wait, what? Your mom? The teacher? He was still trying to fit the square peg of this new reality into the round hole of his prejudice. She was a professor of economics at Cambridge, Ethan corrected him gently, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. Vance Global was born from her doctoral thesis. She built it from nothing. He then reached down and placed the worn leather portfolio on the table. The sound it made was soft, but it landed with the weight of a judge's gavel. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough. You're lying, Bradley said, his voice a pathetic squeak. It was a last, desperate gasp of the old reality. You're making this all up to get back at us. Ethan didn't even look at him. His focus was on Richard. Am I lying, Richard? You're a senior vice president. You have access to the company's history. You know the founder's name. Tell them. Richard couldn't speak. He could only stare at Ethan, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, sickening respect. He was staring at the abyss that had just opened up beneath his feet. Sophia finally found her voice. Ethan? She breathed, the single word a universe of questions. Is it true? Why didn't you tell me? Who are you? Ethan turned to his wife, and for the first time, his expression softened. A hint of the man she knew returning. I'm sorry, Soph. I wanted to tell you, but I could never find the right time. And I needed you to see this. I needed you to see them for who they really are, without the shield of their perceived power. He then turned back to the stunned family. My mother and I are very close. We speak every day. In fact, he said, pulling his phone from his pocket, she's been waiting for my call. He unlocked the phone, and his thumb hovered over a single name on his contact list. Eleanor. She's in town for a few days, finalizing the details for the new foundation headquarters, the one I'm designing for her. She was going to meet me here for coffee after you left. He looked around the table, a faint, sad smile on his lips. But I think under the circumstances, perhaps she should join us now. I'm sure she would be fascinated to hear your opinions on her simple life in person." He pressed the call button. The ringing, soft and digital, was the sound of their world ending. The arrival of Eleanor Vance was not the grand entrance the Hamiltons, in their wildest dreams or nightmares, might have imagined. There was no fleet of black cars, no phalanx of bodyguards. She walked into the restaurant alone, a few moments after Ethan's call, as if she were any other patron arriving for a late lunch. She was a woman in her late 60s, dressed in a simple but elegant charcoal gray pantsuit. Her gray hair was cut in a smart, no-nonsense style, and she wore no jewelry save for a simple, classic watch. She carried no designer handbag, only a thin tablet in a leather case. She was not the eccentric recluse of Margaret's imagination, nor was she the quaint country bumpkin they had mocked. She was something far more intimidating, a woman entirely, completely, and comfortably herself. Her power was not in her clothes or her accessories. It was in her posture, in the calm, intelligent curiosity in her eyes, in the absolute stillness of her presence. As she walked through the restaurant, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People didn't gawk, but they noticed. They sensed they were in the presence of someone significant, even if they didn't know who she was. She spotted their table, and her eyes met Ethan's. A warm, genuine smile lit up her face, a smile of pure affection. Then her gaze swept over the other occupants of the table, and the smile faded, replaced by a neutral, unreadable expression. She had seen the battlefield from afar. Now she was surveying the damage up close. Ethan stood up. "Mom, I'm so glad you could join us." The word "mom" hung in the air, a final confirmation of the impossible truth. Richard Hamilton, who had been frozen in a state of catatonic shock, flinched as if he had been struck. He made a clumsy, aborted motion to stand, half rising from his chair before sinking back down, his body seemingly refusing to obey his commands. Margaret was as still as a statue, her face a mask of waxy horror. Bradley looked like a child who had been caught red-handed, his earlier smirk replaced by a slack-jawed panic. Eleanor walked to the table and placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Ethan, I hope I'm not interrupting." Her voice was calm and melodic, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. "Not at all," Ethan said, pulling out a chair for her. "We were just having a fascinating conversation. Weren't we, Richard?" Eleanor sat down, placing her tablet on the table next to Ethan's portfolio. The two objects, one old and one new, sat side by side, symbols of a power that spanned generations. She looked at Richard, her head tilted slightly. "Richard Hamilton," she said, her voice even. It wasn't a question. "We haven't been formally introduced, though I've certainly read your reports for many years. You have a commendable grasp of market logistics, though your risk assessment can be, at times, a bit conservative." It was a devastatingly precise critique, delivered with the casual authority of a professor grading a student's paper. Richard's face, which had been ashen, began to turn a blotchy red. He was being evaluated, his entire career summed up in a single, dismissive sentence by the woman who owned the company. Eleanor then turned her gaze to Margaret. "And you must be Margaret." Her eyes, sharp and discerning, did a quick, almost imperceptible scan of Margaret's expensive dress, her perfect hair, her diamond jewelry. "I understand you were concerned about my well-being in my retirement. That's very thoughtful of you." She was using the moral mirror, holding up their own words for them to see their grotesque reflection. Margaret visibly shrank in her seat, a choked, strangled sound escaping her throat. I didn't, we didn't know," she stammered. "You didn't know who I was," Eleanor finished for her, her voice still gentle but now with a sharp steel edge. "So you felt it was appropriate to mock a person you imagined to be of a lower social standing than yourselves? You assumed my life was simple, and uncomplicated because I choose not to live in the public eye. You judged my son's worth not by his character or his talent, which I assure you are both extraordinary, but by the brand of his watch and the size of his car. She paused, letting the indictment settle. You are concerned with appearances, Margaret, so let me ask you, how does it appear to have the senior vice president of a global corporation and his family openly mock the son of the company's founder, the very company that affords you this lifestyle? There was no answer. There was nothing they could say. Every word of denial, every stammered apology would only dig their graves deeper. Finally, Eleanor's cool gaze fell upon Bradley. He flinched, physically recoiling as if her eyes were hot lamps. "And you," she said, her voice dropping the last vestiges of gentility, "you believe my son is dragging your sister down. You offered your opinion that her life with him would be a sad imitation of my own. Let me be perfectly clear. If Sophia is lucky enough to build a life half as fulfilling, half as impactful, and half as rich in love and purpose as the one I have built, she will be one of the most fortunate women on this earth. The shack in the woods you so contemptuously described happens to be a 10,000 square foot sustainable living research center that my foundation operates, which Ethan designed. The jam making you mocked is my one silly hobby, but the profits from my little stand at the local farmers market last year funded the construction of 3 freshwater wells in sub-Saharan Africa. So you will forgive me if I don't particularly value your assessment of what constitutes a worthy life." The demolition was complete. She had not raised her voice. She had not used a single curse word. She had simply dismantled their entire world using the truth as her only weapon. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted, shattered, and remade in a form they could barely comprehend. They were no longer the judges, they were the judged, and the verdict was guilty on all counts. The immediate aftermath was a study in silence. The vibrant, noisy restaurant seemed to fade into the background, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation becoming a distant, irrelevant buzz. The world had shrunk to the space around their table, a pocket of cold, terrifying reality. Richard, Margaret, and Bradley sat frozen, like figures in a wax museum exhibit titled "The Fall of the Arrogant." Eleanor let the silence stretch, a deliberate, tactical move. She was giving them time to fully comprehend the depth of the chasm that had opened beneath them. She was allowing the echoes of her words to reverberate in the hollow spaces where their pride used to be. Finally, Richard moved. It was a slow, creaking motion, as if his joints had rusted. He fumbled for his water glass, his hand trembling so violently that water sloshed over the rim onto the pristine white tablecloth. The spreading stain was a fitting metaphor for the mess he had made of his life. "Mrs. Vance, Eleanor," he began, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable croak. I am, there are no words. I am mortified, ashamed. If I had known, if you had known," Eleanor interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. She leaned forward, her calm demeanor giving way to a flash of pure, focused intensity. "That is precisely the point, Richard. That is the crux of the entire problem. Your courtesy, your respect, it is conditional. It is a currency you spend only on those you perceive to be powerful or useful to you. You treat the waiter, the janitor, or the man you believe designs patios with contempt because you believe they are beneath you. You don't see people. You see status. You see hierarchy. And you have just demonstrated, in the most spectacular fashion, that you are morally unfit for a leadership position in a company that I built on the principle of human dignity." The words "morally unfit for leadership" struck Richard like a physical blow. It was a judgment far worse than being fired. It was an indictment of his very character, delivered by the one person whose opinion could shatter his career. Panic, raw and undisguised, finally broke through Margaret's frozen facade. "Please," she whispered, her eyes darting between Eleanor and Ethan. "It was a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. We were wrong. We are so sorry." Her apology was a desperate plea for self-preservation, not a genuine expression of remorse. It was the apology of someone caught, not someone repentant. Eleanor's gaze shifted to her son. She had made her point. She had established the new reality. Now she would cede the floor. This was his battle, and the final moves had to be his. "My mother is right, Richard," Ethan said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority he had held in reserve for so long. "Your behavior wasn't just rude. It was a symptom of a sickness, a belief that your position gives you the right to diminish others." He paused, then delivered the blow that was both a punishment and a perverse kind of mercy. "You're not fired," he said. A flicker of hope, insane and desperate, sparked in Richard's eyes. "Oh no," Ethan continued, extinguishing the spark immediately. "That would be too easy. An easy end to your career, a generous severance package, and you could spin a story about retiring early to spend more time with your family. No, you will continue to come to work every day. You will continue to sit in your large corner office, and you will live in fear. Every email you send, every meeting you attend, every decision you make, you will wonder if it's the one that will finally be deemed unsatisfactory. You will experience the same anxiety and uncertainty that people in lower positions feel every single day. You will learn empathy, Richard, whether you want to or not." He then looked at Bradley. "Your position in the company is redundant. It was created as a favor. That favor has been rescinded. Your employment at Vance Global is terminated, effective immediately. Human Resources will have your paperwork ready this afternoon. I suggest you learn how to write a resume. It's a valuable life skill." Bradley's jaw dropped. The reality of being cut off, of having to face the world without the protective shield of his father and Vance Global, was a concept so alien he couldn't grasp it. Finally, Ethan's gaze rested on Sophia. She was weeping silently, her face a portrait of shame and misery. She was caught between the family she was born into and the man she had chosen. Eleanor, seeing the profound distress on Sophia's face, spoke again, her tone softening slightly. "The choices we make define us," she said, her words directed at Sophia, but meant for the entire table. "But so do the choices we fail to make. Silence in the face of injustice is a choice. It is an endorsement." She looked from Sophia to Ethan. "Your future, Richard, and the future of your family's relationship with my son is no longer in my hands. It is in his. You spent the morning trying to humiliate him. You will now spend your foreseeable future trying to earn his forgiveness. I wish you the best of luck. You will need it." With that, she stood up, a queen who had surveyed her dominion, restored order, and was now ready to move on to more important matters. "Ethan, shall we go? I believe we have a headquarters to finalize." She had given them their sentence. They were to live in the world they had created, a world where worth was transactional and respect was something to be begged for from the very person they had deemed worthless. The weeks that followed the brunch were a masterclass in quiet desperation for the Hamilton family. The world had not ended with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing unraveling of everything they held dear. Ethan's sentence, to let them live with the consequences, was a far crueler and more effective punishment than immediate termination would have been. Richard Hamilton became a ghost in his own office. He still wore the expensive suits, still parked in his reserved spot, but the aura of power that had once surrounded him was gone, replaced by a palpable cloud of fear. His colleagues, sensing the shift in the corporate winds, began to avoid him. Invitations to lunch dried up. His opinions in meetings, once treated as gospel, were now met with polite but non-committal nods. He was a king in exile, forced to watch his own kingdom from a glass-walled prison. He sent Ethan a series of increasingly desperate emails, each one a more pathetic attempt at an apology than the last. He offered gifts, cases of expensive wine, courtside tickets, a weekend at his vacation home, all of which Ethan politely but firmly refused via short, formal emails. Ethan wasn't interested in tribute, he was interested in change, and he knew that true change, for a man like Richard, had to be forged in the fires of humility. Bradley's fall was far more direct and brutal. Stripped of his title and his unearned salary, he was cast out into a world that did not know or care about the Hamilton name. His first attempts to find a job were a complete farce. He had a resume that was a work of fiction and an attitude that reeked of unearned entitlement. He was forced to move back into his parents' house, a 30-year-old man-child whose primary purpose had been stripped away. The smirk was gone, replaced by a permanent scowl of sullen resentment. He blamed Ethan. He blamed his father. He blamed the world. He blamed everyone but himself. His fate was a stark illustration of what happens when a person who has been propped up their whole life finally has the stilts kicked out from under them. Margaret's punishment was social. News of the Brunch incident, as it came to be whispered about, spread like wildfire through their elite circles. The exact details were fuzzy, but the core truth was clear. The Hamiltons had profoundly offended someone far more powerful than themselves, and their standing was now toxic. Invitations to galas became mysteriously lost in the mail. Her calls to her dearest friends went unreturned. She was being shooned, not with open hostility, but with the cold, polite indifference that is the upper class's most effective weapon. She was forced to confront a life without the validation of her social peers, and she found it empty and terrifying. But the real drama, the one that mattered most to Ethan, was playing out in his own home. The first few days after the brunch, the silence between him and Sophia was as vast and cold as a winter ocean. She moved around their apartment like a ghost, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her face etched with a shame so deep it was painful to look at. Finally, one evening, she broke. She found him sitting in his home office, sketching in a notebook. He wasn't working on a billion-dollar headquarters. He was designing a small community park, a pro bono project for a low-income neighborhood. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice small. Ethan put down his pencil and turned to face her. He said nothing, simply waited. "I am so sorry, Ethan," she began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I was a coward. I was weak. I sat there and I let them tear you apart and I did nothing. There is no excuse. None. I was so afraid of their disapproval, I failed to stand up for the one person I'm supposed to love and protect." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of genuine remorse. "It's not just about the brunch, is it?" she continued, her voice raw with self-awareness. "It's been like this for years. I've always let them. I've let them make their little jokes, their snide comments. I told myself it was easier to just keep the peace. But peace at your expense isn't peace. It's poison. And I've been letting them poison our marriage." She took a shaky breath. "When your mother walked in, I wasn't just shocked that she was Eleanor Vance. I was ashamed. Ashamed that this incredible, powerful, brilliant woman was your mother, and I had allowed my family to treat her, and you, with such profound disrespect. I didn't know about the money or the power, Ethan, I swear, but that shouldn't matter. It shouldn't take knowing someone is a secret billionaire to treat them with basic human decency." This was it. This was the moment of truth. She had finally articulated the core lesson. Respect should not be conditional. "I know I have broken your trust," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I don't know if I can ever earn it back, but I have to try. I went to see my parents today. I told them that until they can offer you a genuine, heartfelt apology, not for who your mother is, but for how they treated you when they thought you were no one, then I will not be seeing them. I told them that I choose you. I choose our life. I choose a world where people are valued for who they are, not what they have. She had finally made her choice. She had severed the cord. She had chosen integrity over inheritance. Ethan looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw not the silent, frightened woman from the brunch, but a woman finding her own strength, a woman choosing her own values. The anger and hurt that he had carried for so long began to recede, replaced by a familiar, deeper emotion. He stood up, walked over to her, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I choose you too, Sophia," he said softly. "I always have." Months later, a new equilibrium had settled. The world was different, realigned along truer, more honest principles. The changes were not dramatic, but they were profound. Richard Hamilton was still at Vance Global, but his role had been fundamentally altered. After a long and excruciatingly humble conversation with Ethan, one in which he finally offered a genuine apology devoid of excuses, Ethan had spoken to his mother. Richard was not restored to his former glory, but he was given a new purpose. He was moved from the profit-driven sales division to the corporate responsibility wing, tasked with overseeing ethical sourcing and community investment programs. It was a role with less glamour and a smaller bonus, but it forced him to engage with the world in a way he never had before. He started visiting factories, meeting workers, and seeing the human impact of the corporate machine. Slowly, painstakingly, the arrogant titan was being replaced by a more thoughtful, humbled man. He and Ethan would never be friends, but they had reached a place of quiet, professional respect. Margaret, deprived of her social stage, had withered for a time. But then, something unexpected happened. With nothing to prove and no one to impress, she started volunteering. Not at a glamorous charity gala, but at a local hospital, reading to sick children. At first it was a way to fill the empty hours, but gradually it became something more. She discovered a part of herself that had long been dormant, a capacity for simple, unrewarded kindness. Her relationship with Sophia began to mend, built not on social obligations, but on shared, quiet afternoons talking about books and life. Bradley was the family's lost cause. Unable or unwilling to adapt, he drifted, taking a series of low-level jobs and quickly losing them. He remained a bitter, resentful presence in his parents' lives, a constant reminder of the price of unearned privilege. His fate was a sad but necessary counterpoint to the redemption of his parents. Not everyone, the story seemed to say, is capable of change. The true transformation, however, was in Ethan and Sophia's marriage. Freed from the toxic influence of her family, their relationship blossomed. Their trust, having been broken and then painstakingly rebuilt, was now stronger than ever. They communicated with a new, profound honesty. Sophia enrolled in law school, focusing on public interest law, a path she had abandoned years ago under pressure from her father to pursue a more suitable and less demanding career. She was finding her own power, a power that had nothing to do with her family name or her husband's connections. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan and Sophia stood on a hill overlooking a sprawling construction site. The steel skeleton of a magnificent building was rising against the city skyline. It was the new headquarters for the Vance Foundation, Ethan's design brought to life. It was a building of soaring glass and clean lines, a structure that was both beautiful and deeply functional, a perfect physical manifestation of his mother's ethos. Eleanor Vance stood with them, her arm linked through Sophia's. She was no longer just Ethan's mother or Sophia's powerful mother-in-law. She had become a mentor to Sophia, a friend. "It's beautiful, Ethan," Eleanor said, her eyes shining with pride as she looked at the rising structure. "It's everything I dreamed it would be." "We built it together," Ethan said, his gaze shifting from the building to his mother, and then to his wife. He wasn't just talking about the steel and glass. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out his wallet. Tucked inside a worn plastic sleeve was a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than 10, standing proudly next to a ridiculously complex treehouse. It had multiple levels, a working pulley system, and a small, hand-painted sign that read, Vance HQ. A woman with a warm smile, a younger Eleanor, had her arm around his shoulders. He had always been an architect. He had always been his mother's son. The world, in its blindness, had just taken a very long time to see it. The story of the brunch became a quiet legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms of Vance Global. It served as a reminder that true power is rarely loud, and that true worth has nothing to do with a title or a bank balance. It's about integrity. It's about character. It's about treating the person who cleans the floors with the same respect as the person who signs the checks. Not because you might one day discover they own the company, but because it's the right thing to do. In the end, Ethan never sought revenge. He had the power to destroy the Hamiltons, to crush them utterly. But he chose a different path. He chose to give them a chance to become better people. He held up a mirror, and in doing so, he gave them the harshest punishment and the greatest gift of all, the unvarnished truth. For true wealth is not the ability to buy anything you want, but the wisdom to understand what is truly valuable. And that was a lesson the Hamiltons were finally, painfully, beginning to learn.